Now, you cannot have a postmodern world without its being preceded by a modern age, a modern world. Now, it just so happens that the modern age, the modern world, what gave definition and substance and content to the modern age is the work of the philosopher Kant, for example. And, well, to some extent, Hegel. These two guys are the giants. Their thought really dominated 19th century thought. The modern age is simply another way in which we refer to the Enlightenment. Now, as we go through first Diogenes Allen and then Alistair McGrath's essays, we'll find these guys identifying some of the major characteristics of the modern world and how those characteristics of the modern world threatened the Christian faith. In fact, led many, many modern intellectuals to repudiate the Christian faith. But now, we're told, the modern age has collapsed. The basic assumptions, the basic presuppositions of the Enlightenment are rapidly being abandoned, and we are being plunged into postmodernity. Diogenes Allen thinks this is good. He thinks this opens up new opportunities for Christians to make their faith relevant. As I will show you, I am not at all convinced that postmodernity is a healthy sign, is a healthy movement. Looking at the thinkers who helped shape the nature of the modern world, by which I mean the post-Enlightenment age, the 18th century, the 19th century, the early 20th century. And we'll look at how that post-Enlightenment world, let me not confuse you here. When I talk about post-Enlightenment, I'm talking about a culture, a civilization that is still controlled by Enlightenment presuppositions. When I talk about the postmodern world, I'm talking about a culture that has begun to break loose from the presuppositions of the Enlightenment. Okay, I hope I don't confuse you there. Now, as we go through the 19th century, we will begin to see various thinkers challenging features of the Enlightenment. Kierkegaard did. In fact, let me identify the thinker who will probably be the pivotal figure in this course. It will surprise you. It will be Friedrich Nietzsche. Because, as I will argue, Nietzsche was probably the only figure, the only personality in this period of 2 centuries who fully understood what would happen to the modern world when people became fully conscious of its structure, of its nature. And even though Nietzsche didn't use language like postmodernity, he actually predicted the situation into which we are presently being plunged. He predicted the descent of darkness. And he did that, of course, from a perspective that was totally anti-Christian. One of his more blasphemous titles is the Antichrist, where he saw himself as the embodiment of modern civilization's resistance to the Christian faith. Well, let's take a look, first of all, at Diogenes Allen's little essay. And I've actually made my notes on 2 copies here. Diogenes says the modern world is collapsing. Let me say now a little bit more about what we mean by the modern age. The Enlightenment can be summarized in 3 words: nature, reason, and progress. When we talk about the Enlightenment's emphasis upon nature, what we are referring to is the ultimacy of the natural order, the self-contained nature of the natural order. Another word for this would be naturalism. Nature and the sciences that study nature do not need any help from religion. They do not need any help from God. They do not need any help from revelation. Some of you have taken the apologetics course in which I talk about naturalism. And I describe naturalism in terms of a box, where the box represents the natural order, which is totally cut off from anything that might exist outside the box, from anything that might influence the natural order from outside. Everything that happens in the world is caused by other things that exist within the world. This is naturalism. And this box that constitutes the natural order, of course, must be eternal, even though the nature and the structure of what exists within the box will have evolved and changed over many millions of years. When I contrast naturalism with the Christian worldview in the apologetics course, those of you who've taken it remember that I draw a box that has a hole in it. It is not an enclosed box, it is a box that has a door or a window, because that's supposed to illustrate 3 points. 1, that God exists outside of nature. 2, that God had created the box, God created the natural order. And 3, God exists within the God acts causally within the natural order. Now, what we're going to find in our investigation of naturalism is how Kant and the philosophers who followed him set up this model of the natural order in which it is effectively immune, cut off from any relationship to the divine, to any relationship to revelation, and so on. This, of course, then, is one of the basic presuppositions of the modern age. This is why intellectuals go through life saying, we have no need for God. Even if there were a God, we don't need him. This supports their repudiation of revelation, of the church, of historic Christian thought. The second undergirding presupposition of the Enlightenment is its emphasis upon reason, as opposed to revelation. Modern man was totally convinced that the human mind was sufficient to discover all important truth. There was nothing that we had to learn from Christianity. There was nothing we had to learn from special revelation. If it's out there, if it's knowable, if it's true, the human mind can apprehend it on its own. In fact, if the church makes claims that are unacceptable to human reason, then modern man will reject those claims. The test of truth becomes not the Word of God or the mind of God, the test of truth becomes the mind of man, human reason. The third element of Enlightenment thinking is its unbounded optimism about the future. The inevitability of human progress. You will see this in Kant's essay on history. In fact, if I were Kant and I were permitted to come back from the grave and reread that essay today, I would be overcome, first of all, by enormous embarrassment and then repentance. It's difficult to believe that there was a time in recent human history when people believed the nonsense that Kant talks about. And yet, you don't have to go too far to find modern intellectuals, the people who think they're the cultural trendsetters in our age, thinking the same way. That human reason will establish the social and the political and the economic institutions that will enable us to march inevitably towards utopia. That the path of the future there will be bumps in the path to the future, but it is always a march forward and upwards, progress. Let me tell you a true story. Of course, every story I tell is true, for the most part. I was once asked if I wanted to become part of a team that would represent the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools. There was a small Christian college somewhere in the Mid-South. It was a college connected with the Church of Christ denomination. Now, they were adding a new graduate program, a master's program in religion, and they had to get approval from the Accrediting Association. So the Accrediting Association put together a team of 3 people. One of them was the president of the Southern Association, who at that time was a Southern Baptist. Interesting guy. The college wanted to protect its rear, so they invited me, because they knew that I would be generally supportive. And then they had to pick a third person, and so they selected someone who had been raised in their own denomination, been raised in the Church of Christ, and had then gone on and had graduated from a Church of Christ college and had gone on to get a PhD from some Ivy League school, as I recall, and he was now teaching New Testament at a school that I will not name, a liberal Methodist school. So here was the team. The head of the Southern Association, this philosopher from a state university, and the guy that they all thought, these Church of Christ college people thought would be their best ally, because he came from their own tradition. What they didn't know was he had apostatized. He'd lost his faith along the way. But as we sat in these meetings, I watched this guy wrestle with the dilemma into which he had been placed. He didn't want his former Church of Christ allies to know how liberal he had become. He didn't really want to be the guy to stick the knife in, and yet he hated this program. He hated this school because it represented everything that he had outgrown. So we had these big fights in our little meeting, and there I was defending this Church of Christ college against this Church of Christ apostate, see? And finally, in exasperation, this guy blurted out this phrase, and it's one of these things that stays with you forever. He pounded his fist on the table and he said, the trouble with these people is their view of the Bible is pre-enlightenment. Ah, I thought, you have said it, buddy. You have said it. Their view of the Bible is pre-enlightenment. In other words, there are a bunch of fundamentalists who are totally cut off from all that has made the modern world great. And if you want to know how great the modern world is, look at me. See? Pre-Enlightenment. Now, I'll concede that this particular college was pre-Enlightenment. I'll concede that. Now, I must also say here that maybe that explains why so many Church of Christ colleges use my books as texts. I don't know. We got to hope that they don't hear that. That there was a segment of biblical scholarship that had joined, that had entered into combat with modernity, with modern thinking, with post-Enlightenment thinking, and had challenged it effectively. He had no idea that there was a method of apologetics that could help you do battle with these systems. He had simply surrendered. He had sold out. He had turned his back on his childhood faith, but of course he didn't want anybody to know that. Now, in the 5 minutes that's left, turn to the second page of Allen's article. And we're going to be pretty dependent on what he says here. At the bottom of page 340, Diogenes Allen refers to an analogy, an allegory, developed by a British thinker named Basil Mitchell. Let me quote from the bottom of page 340. Basil Mitchell pictures traditional Christian theology as a barge going down a river. On one side of the river are shoals, shallow areas, treacherous areas, representing the works of David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Let's draw a little diagram here, and maybe we can get this in the... Here's the river. Here are the barges going down the river. And on one side we have these shoals that represent the horrendous, the unanswerable challenges to Christian faith developed by David Hume and Immanuel Kant. We talk about those challenges in other courses, in our apologetics course and so on. Now, this side of the river, then, would be modernity. All right, now, notice the interesting allegory here. To avoid these shoals, theologians have either jettisoned some of the cargo to lighten the barge and sail safely over them. That's what we call religious modernism. That's what religious liberalism did during the late 19th and first half of the 20th century. It threw overboard almost every important Christian belief. And in Basil Mitchell's interesting allegory, this would lighten the load of the barge and enable it to pass over the dangerous shoals created by Hume and Kant. Now, the other alternative... So you you jettison all of these basic Christian beliefs. The other alternative is to pass over to the other side of the river, which is pre-Enlightenment or pre-modern. And you just proceed as though the challenges of modernity never existed at all. Now notice how Basil Mitchell puts this. That is, they either became modern or modernists or liberals by getting rid of lots of traditional Christian claims, sometimes even the claims that God is creator and redeemer in Christ, or they retain the language of traditional Christianity, but at the price of repudiating in various degrees the need to take into account knowledge from any other domain. For those who become pre-modern, and that would be the fundamentalists, the people at this Church of Christ college, Christian doctrines can be affirmed and discussed as if Hume's and Kant's objections simply do not exist. Now, what Allen is going to argue in the rest of his article is, and this is really weird that he doesn't see this. He's going to argue that these shoals have been blown up. They've been exploded. Ross Perot was out there with his ship, and Rush Limbaugh talks about Ross Perot's yacht all the time. So he blows up the coral reef, and he blows up the everything else. So then we can safely pass down the river by avoiding all of this fundamentalist pre-modern stuff. What Alan doesn't realize is that there have been people around for the last 2 centuries who have been challenging those shoals. Instead of throwing over important Christian beliefs, they've been blowing up the shoals, and where has Alan been while all of this is happening? He writes as though it's only now, when certain things have happened in our culture, that we've moved from the modern to the postmodern age, that we can safely traverse this side of the shore. Oh, come on. There have been all kinds of third alternatives. We could picture that either by saying that there have been people who've been chopping down those shoals, as we show you in our apologetics course, or you can steer a safe path down the middle of the river to avoid the extremes of fundamentalism on one hand, or pre-modernity or pre-enlightenment thinking. There is this third path. There's a clear channel down the middle of the river. Well, I do want to take issue with what Alan says after we come back, but this is the way he sets up his article. I was probably doing you a disservice by taking some things for granted that I should not do. So, let me give you a little chart that perhaps will amplify some of the things I was trying to say about the Enlightenment. Let's have a timeline here. And we'll leave that indeterminate. We'll make this 1700, make this 1800, make this 1900, and we'll make something of this chart available to the people who will be listening to this by tape. So we're going to give you a little timeline. First point I want to make regarding this timeline is that the word Enlightenment is a later term that historians of ideas developed. No one in the 18th century said, "Ooh, I'm the first Enlightenment philosopher." This was a later term to describe some things that happened. Point 2, the Enlightenment developed differently in different nations. There was, of course, cross-breeding of ideas as various people talked to each other and read each other's books and so on. But the German Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment, these all proceeded somewhat independently of each other. I suppose the major figure of the English Enlightenment, let's just mention several countries here. Probably the culmination of the English Enlightenment, the British Enlightenment, is what we find in the work of David Hume. The culmination of the German Enlightenment is what we find in the work of Kant. The French Enlightenment, probably Voltaire. And notice that there are some differences here. Voltaire was rabidly anti-religious. Voltaire was clearly a deist. Hume is much more difficult to categorize, and those of you who've taken the little apologetics course perhaps can appreciate that better. There are certain stereotypes of Hume's philosophy floating around. His work is actually much more sophisticated and much more complex than it appears. And of course, Kant regarded himself as a person who was trying to provide a philosophical foundation for a fairly traditional set of Christian ideas. Kant certainly thought that he was trying to provide a philosophical framework for Christian metaphysical beliefs and Christian moral beliefs, so that you don't want to make the mistake of thinking that the Enlightenment followed exactly the same stages in each country. As far as time goes, probably the 20-year period between 1780 and 1800 would mark the end of the major works that represent Enlightenment-style thinking. It's a little difficult to know what works you would identify as representing the earlier stages of the Enlightenment. For example, in England, John Locke, the English philosopher, is often spoken of as the forerunner of the Enlightenment in England. Well, that involves some oversimplification. In some ways, Locke anticipated the Enlightenment. In other ways, he didn't. So whatever form it took and whatever thinkers represented the Enlightenment during, let's say, the last two-thirds of the 19th century, the major ideas they represented were these: nature, which assumed the form of naturalism, as I described; reason, that human reason becomes the test of what is knowable, what is acceptable, what is believable, and the belief in human progress. Now, I used a term during the first hour. I used the term post-Enlightenment. And here's where some of you got confused. The reason why we talk about the post-Enlightenment period is because the Enlightenment per se fades away by the time we get into the 19th century. But the presuppositions of the Enlightenment, its ideas, these ideas right here, begin to dominate much of Western culture, continue to dominate much of Western culture through the start of the 20th century. So I used these two terms interchangeably during the first hour, and some of you missed that. The post-Enlightenment world is the world of modernity. It is the world that is characterized by a growing skepticism towards religion, a growing skepticism towards orthodox religion. It is characterized by growing secularism. It is characterized by scientism, confidence in the ability of the scientific method. In what sense can this be considered post-Enlightenment? Because the Enlightenment per se ends with the work of Kant and Voltaire and Hume. There's always a clash of ideas within a culture. And so during the 19th century, we get a clash between remnants of Enlightenment theories and Romanticism, and then later on still other conflicts. So the post-Enlightenment world is the world that the Enlightenment gave birth to. The kind of culture that continued to incarnate, serve as an incarnation of Enlightenment presuppositions. It was an atmosphere, an environment that was hostile to historic Christianity. In my book, Christian Faith and Historical Understanding, which those of you who've taken the apologetics course have read, the first couple of chapters in that book talk about events that occurred in the last half of the 19th century. Take, for example, the liberal lives of Jesus that became such a fascination with people. These books were written by post-Enlightenment intellectuals who had become convinced that the biblical portrait of Jesus was incredible, no longer acceptable. So what they embarked on the quest for the historical Jesus. And what was it? It was an attempt to rewrite the Christian faith and produce a totally new Jesus who was in fact a prototype of the liberal, the post-Enlightenment, the modernist mind. All right? And again, what is that? It's skepticism. Skepticism towards revelation. Skepticism towards the Word of God. Skepticism with respect to miracles. It's secularism. Religion gets pushed off into a corner. It's scientism. This is where we get the whole rise of modern biblical criticism. And one of the things I'll be doing next week or the week after is trying to suggest the subtle influence that Hegel had on some of that work. Now, when we talk about postmodernity, the postmodern world, let's put 1980 up here, the presuppositions of this post-Enlightenment world begin to collapse. They begin to lose credibility. And a whole new collection of ideas begin to capture the people who present themselves as pace-setters of the culture. Here's what Diogenes Allen says. Diogenes Allen says, I have sensed for the last 20 or so years that modernity was collapsing. But it happened slowly. I would say that it has come to prominence only, I've only been paying attention to it for the last 7 or 8 years, okay? Take a look at the books that, don't do it now, but take a look at the books that Alistair McGrath cites in some of his footnotes, and these are all post-1980 books. Let me also say this. Just as the term the Enlightenment is kind of an artificial construct, where we come along later and say, well, let's give a name to this. What should we call it? Let's call it the Enlightenment. So, postmodernity is an artificial construct where all of a sudden we take a look at what's happening in various disciplines and we see some similar forces at work and we say, boy, let's find a name for this. Well, all right, let's call it postmodernism then. Here's what Diogenes Allen says. He says, clearly, the presuppositions of the modern age were being abandoned. So, what better name to use for what was now happening than postmodern? Okay, we have moved beyond the modern. Largely an accident, I think, except everybody seemed to come up with the same term. All of these book titles that Alistair McGrath refers to in his footnotes seem to use that idea. So I don't know that you could really trace this back to any particular individual. Again, it's something of an artificial construct. One of the points I plan to make later today in response to Allen is that he's probably mistaken in thinking of the collapse of modernity only as a relatively recent development. I'm going to argue that the signs that the characteristics of movements that mark a break with modernity can actually be found through the 19th century and in the early 20th century. That Romanticism, in its way, was a break with modernity. That the existentialists really marked a break with modernity. Kierkegaard was an anti-modern thinker. He was a postmodern thinker. Nietzsche, in some ways, to repeat a point made during the first hour, Nietzsche, who well, of course, spent the last 10 years of the 19th century in an insane asylum, and he was absolutely bugged out of his mind. But during the last 10 years of Nietzsche's productive life, which would be 1880 to, say, 1889, Nietzsche clearly saw that the modern, that something was happening to the world, and the world was heading for something sinister and dark and dreadful, something that Nietzsche called nihilism. I think Nietzsche is really the pivotal thinker of the last 2 centuries in the sense that he embodied, he represented the modern age, but he saw that it was collapsing, and he saw clearly what would happen to Western civilization once those anti-Christian ideas really took hold in Western civilization.